I also want to just explain that for me, I jump up and ask a lot of questions, and I think collaboratively, I work collaboratively. I am not a lone genius, and I met Liz at a conference. It sounds so sexy. I met Liz at a conference in Paris, and we just walked together and talked together, and I won't let her go. And I feel like this group, and for whatever reason, I think it's the importance of thinking carefully about aging. And there are stakes involved, there's real people. And I'm just so grateful to be able to think with you. And so when I ask tough questions, because it matters. And so I don't mind the tough questions coming at me. And I've fought with Margaret, and so I have that kind of agonistic style. So come at me if you have questions. And it's in the spirit of the engagement is a sign of respect. So much thanks to Liz for inviting me. And I'm going to be relying on my training as a literary critic to trace what I see as a shift in genre from elegiac to Gothic, to potentially, I'm describing it a little bit, and we'll have time maybe after to have a glass of wine, to an epic approach to understand aging into old age, and particularly aging into age-related dementia. And I'm kind of looking at this shift in genre from the late 19th century to the present. So broadly speaking, until about the 1970s, approaches to dementia were primarily aligned with the elegy. And then from the 70s onward to the present, elegiac approaches have been increasingly eclipsed by Gothic accounts. And you might ask, as I did, so who cares? What does it matter what genre it occurs in? But this shift in genre is significant because it impacts and changes how we respond emotionally. I think now we should light up what side of our brain is working. Emotionally, economically, and politically. The shift in genre really torques that and changes that. So the introduction of the Gothic as a way of framing dementia brings with it an array of rhetorical figures. Some of them we've heard about, the Great Tsunami, the bed blocker, and I'll be speaking about that as well. So it brings with it a way of kind of speaking about and narrating the experience of aging and frail aging that promotes our identification, speaking of value, with age-associated memory loss as an evil, unequivocal evil. And it very reductively aligns it with a kind of Gothic monster, a singular disease that kind of presents itself as a mystery. So it blends the Gothic with us, like Edgar Allan Poe did. He was the father of the Gothic and detective fiction. So it's not just an evil, but it's a crime that needs to be solved. And so it kind of elevates the character of the researcher, the hero scientist, as the detective. And so we've got this kind of elevation of biomedical professionals who, that we're waiting desperately for, like Sherlock Holmes, for these people to give us the pill and solve the crime and tell us what to do, and lock up dementia, I guess. So the shift from the Gothic to what I see as a epic approach puts the onus on the community, the nation state, to enhance brain health. And this, I think, really is important because I want to prize it apart from successful aging. That kind of makes the responsibility on the individual. I see us returning to a communal approach that says, look, prenatal nutrition, postnatal nutrition, education, these are all, and making sure we don't get hit in the head too often. My daughter's a hockey player. I think about that a lot. So I think we really need to sort of kind of reconceptualize the genre. And I think that those potentially, I'm a kind of hopeful age studies person, I think those reconceptualizations will help us live perhaps a better or even good life. So let's kind of drill down a little bit. So what's an elegy? And the elegy is a genre that attempts to lament, contextualize, and possibly grant larger and lasting meaning to a person and occasionally a group who've passed away. And my slides don't match what I say, because I think that gets boring. So the Gothic. And the Gothic emerged long after the elegy in the mid-18th century with the publication of Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, 1764. And this really does the Gothic treats death as both a crime and a mystery that subsequent narrative works to explain, thus providing another avenue for contextualizing and finding meaning in primal loss. So in AIDS and its Metaphor, Susan Sontag, this is in her 1989 publication, reflects on how different diseases have become aligned with Gothic tropes. And she explains that society has a tendency to identify a particular disease and align it with evil. So she says this: in recent years, some of the onus on cancer has been lifted by the emergence of a disease whose charge of stigmatization, whose capacity to create a spoiled identity, is far greater. It seems that societies need to have one illness which becomes identified with evil and attaches blame to its victims, but it's hard to be obsessed with more than one. So just as AIDS eclipsed the popular misidentification of cancer as an epidemic, I'd argue that Alzheimer's has, following Sontag, banalized or banalized AIDS. Americans now fear Alzheimer's more than any disease, including cancer, AIDS as well. And so Sontag calls these illnesses master illnesses, and she tracks in her writing how tuberculosis, cancer, and subsequently AIDS, and now I would say Alzheimer's, are perceived as, and I quote Sontag, the germ of death itself, end quote. So it's these type of fatal diseases, Sontag argues, thought to be multi-determined, that is mysterious, that have the widest possibilities as metaphors for what is felt to be socially or morally wrong. And once categorized as morally wrong and horrifying, these illnesses are, in fact, transported into the territory of the Gothic, a literary mode that typically features monsters and monstrous transformations. The meanings attributed to the suffering and loss instigated by master illnesses such as Alzheimer's, as well as the delegation of blame, culpability, and agency, are mediated through narrative and, I'm insisting, through literary modes such as the Gothic that articulate the desires for the revelation of secrets and for mastery. So we've been so accustomed to the Gothic approach to aging and to frail old age we've become accustomed. But I want to return to a time, and I'm not sort of suggesting this is a pastoral or utopian moment that we've lost, but bear with me. There was a time when the elegiac held sway. So Ontario newspapers, that's where I'm from, the east of Canada, confidently promoted religious and elegiac modes of consolation in the face of mortality and age-related dementia. So in a lengthy obituary for the minister William Mitford that was published in 1869, the author, D.J., explains Mitford's condition induced a decay of memory and a want of power to keep up an intelligent recognition of men and things, end quote. Nevertheless, he insists that Mitford's faith, love, never wavered, and that miraculously his memory of religious teachings remained untouched by disease. In portraying Mitford's final days, the author illustrates that in the face of degeneration and death, Mitford, and by extension readers, are consoled by the enduring presence of religious faith. And although faith could not alter the degenerative teleology of the life course, repeated references to Mitford's, and I quote, happy state of mind, end quote, afford the possibility of complicating the theory of bodily decline by affirming the potential for psychosocial and intersubjective modes of continuity and solace. And I'm also aware that someone writing an obituary can write whatever the hell he wants. So I'm suspicious of fictions, but nonetheless, I think these fictions offer insight into the way that narratives envelop certain kind of facets of the life course. So elegiac approaches are also, so they designate caregivers' roles and expectations. And I want to make a point about, again, sort of history and Canadian history. Caregiving wasn't necessarily understood just as a familial or a provincial or state responsibility. So prior to the rise of institutionalization in the late 19th century, the dependent elderly were viewed as a familial and community responsibility. So in Ontario, the introduction of newly built asylums minimized communal responsibility. And this is really well evidenced in a wonderful book by a scholar named Montague. And I'll happily talk about that. But anyway, so we've got a shift in responsibility that placed the onus of care either on provincially run institutions or the family, with the community dropping out. So due to asylum superintendents increasing ambitions to cure rather than care for people with mental illness, this is when they began quantifying and collecting statistics on their cure rates. Age-related dementia was increasingly viewed as a shameful and costly inconvenience. So pressure was placed on families by superintendents. They were discharged, and family members were described as quiet and harmless, elderly individuals in their dotage who could be easily cared for at home. And families actually often had a great deal of trouble coping with symptoms of dementia that included, paranoia, delusions, and sometimes people became obstreperous or violent. So the shift from the elegy to the Gothic and its attendant transformations of characters, roles, and settings is evident in stories that feature people aging into frail old age. And what I want to focus on in this next section of my paper is the pressure placed on family members, very often women, that was associated with the shift from the elegy to the Gothic. And it's illustrated in Alice Munro's short story, The Peace of Utrecht. This is a really famous story by the Nobel Prize-winning author, and it's a semi-autobiographical narrative about her own mother's struggle with Parkinson's, which is a neurodegenerative disease that, like Alzheimer's disease, results in dementia. We focus on the tremors, but allied the cognitive hit, but it is there. So rather than focus on her mother's perspective, Munro's story portrays the intimate and conflicting emotional response of the two daughters, Helen and Maddie, and they're both dealing in different ways with their mother's neurodegenerative illness. So Helen, the narrator, is the one who leaves home. She studies at college and marries and has two children. Her sister, Maddie, remains in the small Ontario town of Jubilee, and never marrying, she dedicates herself to caring for their mother for 10 years until the mother dies. And the story unfolds during Helen's brief return to the family with her children. And Helen recalls the shame that she and Maddie felt as teenagers witnessing their mother's decline. And I'm going to just cite this passage. We tried both crudely and artfully to keep her at home, not for her sake, but for ours, who suffered such unnecessary humiliation at the sight of her eyes rolling back in her head in a temporary paralysis of the eye muscles, at the sound of her thickened voice, whose embarrassing pronouncements it was our job to interpret to outsiders. So bizarre was the disease she had in its effects that it made us feel like crying out in apology, though we say stiff and white, as if we were accompanying a particularly tasteless sideshow. We should have let the town have her. It would have treated her better. This passage, for me, recalls the shift between loci of care noted earlier that saw the transfer from quasi-communal to solely familial responsibility for looking after individuals with mental illness. So during the Depression, it was no longer appropriate for the mentally ill, I should say depression with a capital D, 1930s, sorry. It wasn't appropriate for the mentally ill to wander freely about their communities, although in Ontario towns that had been the case. So as this story and others painfully illustrate, the family was expected to bear the entire economic, to shoulder that responsibility, the work and care work involved for looking after their loved ones, to the detriment of pretty much all concerned. So questions about the good life and who's allowed to live it are addressed specifically in Munro's story. So Helen pays a visit. This is the one who's come from away, and she pays a brief visit to her aunts. And she is informed that her mother suffered grievously and needlessly, and her Aunt Annie insists that the mother died prematurely because rather than continuing to care for it at home, Maddie lied to their mother, lured her to a hospital, and abandoned her there. Helen says in defense of her sister, and it was time. But Annie maintains her view that it was only after Maddie left their mother at the hospital that their mother felt she would die. Don't you ever think, Aunt Annie insists, uncharacteristically angry, that a person wants to die just because it seems to everybody else that they've got no reason to go on living. In this scene, Aunt Annie comes closest to challenging the idea that disease alone reduced Helen and Maddie's mother, her life, to one that wasn't worth living. It's not disease that does it. It's the care that's available. And Aunt Annie angrily refutes the belief that Maddie and Helen's mother should acquiesce to death simply because she's suffering from the physical and mental challenges of a dementing illness, a belief that implicitly underlines Helen's banal comment, "It was time." Who decides when it's time for whom? So Aunt Annie goes on to emphasize that Helen's mother begged Maddie to take her home, saying she'd die otherwise, but Maddie refused. Again, Helen attempts to discredit her aunt's comments, this time by insisting her mom didn't always tell the truth. Ignoring Helen, Aunt Annie relates what proves to be the most emotionally devastating information, namely, Helen's and Maddie's mother was so desperate to escape the hospital that she fled at night in the middle of January. It's cold in Ontario, wearing only slippers and a dressing gown. And this information hits Helen hardest because Aunt Annie's Gothic account transforms the girl's mother from a demented monster into a helpless Gothic victim, a maiden fleeing the monster, which is incarceration and death in a hospital. So as a corollary, I think Aunt Annie's tale, and by extension Munro's story, kind of warns us against searching for a real monster, because anyone looking for it has to look elsewhere. It's not the diseased body. It's not the beleaguered carer. So one of the primary functions of the Gothic is to take our anger and fear experienced in the face of illness and death, two notable examples of the evils we experience, and assign the blame for our misfortune to something or someone. In the Gothic, there's seemingly no escape from symbolizing a monster or confronting the horror of the situation. And in the story, Aunt Maddie pronounces judgment on Maddie, and she says it in a typical Presbyterian Ontario fashion. "We thought it was hard. Lou and I," her sister, Aunt Annie's sister, "thought it was hard." And although it might be tempting to side with the aunts and cast Maddie as the true monster, Monroe's sensitive treatment of both the mother's and the girl's plights, as I said, makes it impossible to irrevocably cast Maddie into that Gothic role. Instead, the piece of Utrecht invites both its characters and readers to see how the Gothic model of dementia, a model that views illness as a crime to be solved, constructs rigid notions of the good life and its antithesis, the evil life, that impedes the recognition of people's limitations and humanity, and it potentially obstructs the difficult work of reconciling ourselves to illness, loss, and death. So after returning from her revelatory visit with the aunts, Helen finds her sister Maddie preparing supper in the kitchen, and she admits to having visited the aunts, but rather than revealing what she's been told, Helen murmurs softly, "Don't be guilty, Maddie." Seemingly aware of what Helen has learned, Maddie cries, I couldn't go on. I wanted my life." And her assertion underscores, again, that in that era, the narrative and structure of care created a zero-sum game that afforded only one person in the caregiver-patient dyad the chance to enjoy a good life. So, put differently, socio-political forces put the family in a double bind that pitted the generations against each other, and no one emerged the winner. I see us coming to that space again, rhetorically, an intergenerational war. So the Gothic horror and intergenerational struggles depicted in the piece of Utrecht associated with dementia became even more acute with the consolidation of the disease model in the late 1970s. And before that time, Alzheimer's disease, and I hope people know this, referred to a very rare disease that affected individuals in their 40s and 50s, occasionally even younger, and it was considered to be quite rare. Older people with comparable symptoms and pathologies were diagnosed with something known as senile dementia. In 1976, Dr. Robert Katzman convincingly argued that these forms of dementia were in fact a single disease entity. And in 1988, at the SIBA Foundation Symposium on Aging Research, Katzman openly celebrated the success of his campaign to identify Alzheimer's as this kind of embracing disease across the lifespan. So he said, "I've spent a number of years trying to persuade people that Alzheimer's is a disease and not simply what used to be called senility or senile dementia. And there's been a marvelous progress in research. In my view, this is because people now consider Alzheimer's as a disease." And British geriatrician J. Grimley Evans retorted, "This smacks of politics rather than science." So Evans maintained that in the absence of a solid understanding of what exactly aging was, no conclusion should be reached regarding the issue of aging versus disease. And despite his objections, which remain valid to this day, Katzman's position prevailed. And it's been a position that's extremely effective in drawing attention to the plight of elderly people with dementia and establishing dementia and Alzheimer's as a worthy cause for research funds. But it's also helped to consolidate the view of Alzheimer's, and I go back to Sontag, as the Gothic monster, or what my colleague Peter Whitehouse describes as the monster we have to wage a war on. And we both see the unfortunate repercussions. So Canadian writer Michael Ignatieff, I mentioned him. He ran for the head of the Liberal Party, so that's his picture. He did not succeed. He really helps illustrate the impact of the shift to the Gothic. So his novel Scar Tissue, which as I mentioned was based on his brother Andrew's experience as a carer for their mother, it offers a first-person account, so it's fiction, but it offers a first-person account of a middle-aged philosophy professor who cares for his mother with Alzheimer's and whose brother, interestingly, is framed as a neurologist who remains physically and emotionally detached from the mother's experience. And the narrator views the dementia that runs through his family as a curse, akin to the one that plagued Oedipus and his descendants. And I'm going to cite a passage from the novel it's a bit lengthy, but it clarifies the palpable confusion associated with the remaking of Alzheimer's as a Gothic entity. So this is the narrator of scar tissue. What in my childhood had been called hardening of the arteries was now called senile dementia. Then the doctors took to calling my mother's condition a disease. This at least had the merit of conferring clinical interest upon what, until then, had simply been regarded as the demented confusion of the elderly. When post-mortem examinations of the patients revealed a characteristic pattern of scar tissues in the neural fibers, doctors suddenly believed they had a clinical mystery to unravel. However, the more the doctors discovered, the more puzzling the disease became. While the tangles and plaques, the scar tissue, did obstruct the neurochemical transmission of electrical messages in the brain, they showed up in alert people whose symptoms were confined to mild memory loss associated with normal aging. So as this passage suggests, the disease model instigated a shift away from elegiac modes of consolation and solace and provided the foundation for a Gothic plot, installing a clinical mystery, but one with no clear perpetrator or cause and effect. So unlike the narrator's brother, a scientist who gains comfort from the belief that the answers will surrender themselves eventually to the gaze of science, and science will find a cure, the narrator can't sustain himself with deferred hope. And he cites Kafka and states, "There is hope, but not for us. It will come too late for me." And in the end, Ignatieff's narrator is in the existential position of many people in the 20th century, living in the shadows of a dementing illness that was once considered a natural facet of the life course. So I want to close by suggesting that literature's value in considerations of aging into old age and considerations of the good life doesn't lie in its ability to index, literally use the index finger and point to the truth of mortality and loss. The Gothic continues to beckon because it offers the consolation of clearly demarcated victims and villains. Unlike the elegy, however, the Gothic can't defend against the understanding that there is no cure for what I think of essential evils of decay and loss, evils that are, and forgetting, I should add, integral to our humanity. So rather than rely on literature and an understanding of genre to master dementia, to say, oh, the best genre would be, I would suggest that to think about illness and sort of age-related illness and dementia and potentially secure a better hold on the good life, we can use literature to become more mindful about how particular genres inflect our participation or actually preclude our participation in intergenerational communities characterized by vulnerability, risk, and compassion. Thank you.